Imagine an empire so wealthy that its gold coins could fund Europe for centuries, and a banking family so powerful they could make or break that empire overnight. In the 1700s, India wasn't just a land of kings. It was home to a secret financial network that even emperors feared. One family, the Jagat Seths, held more money than the British East India Company, and their ledgers decided who ruled Bengal, who went bankrupt, and who would ultimately control India itself. But how did a small group of Indian bankers become the invisible hand behind both the Mughal collapse and the British conquest? This is the forgotten story of the men who financed empires and accidentally handed India to Britain. Welcome to Financial History Uncovered. Thank you for listening. Smash that like button. Let's begin. In the early 18th century, under the late Mughals, Bengal wasn't chaos. It was cash. Its fertile fields produced more revenue than all of Britain combined. But unlike Europe, where kings relied on taxes and wars, India had merchant bankers, private financiers who moved money faster than any government. At the center of it all stood one name, Jagat Seths, meaning banker of the world. This wasn't one man, but a dynasty, a powerful Marwari family that built a financial empire from Bengal's trade riches. They managed currency exchange, lent to princes, and even printed their own bills of credit. Think of them as a mix between JP Morgan, the IMF, and a central bank, centuries before those existed. They funded armies, backed rulers, and stabilized trade routes stretching from Delhi to Dhaka. When a Mughal prince needed to pay troops or bribe nobles, he didn't turn to the emperor. He turned to Jagat Seths' vaults. But here's the problem with private power. When money speaks louder than emperors, politics starts to follow finance. By 1730, the Mughals had grown weak. Bengal's Nawabs ruled independently, and the Jagat Seths had become the true power behind the throne. They had financed the empire's wars, and were about to finance its collapse. So the question is, how did a family of accountants end up playing kingmaker to an empire? The answer lies in one battle, and one betrayal, that changed India forever. In 1757, a quiet conspiracy was brewing in Murshidabad, Bengal's capital. The East India Company, led by Robert Clive, wanted more than trade. It wanted power. But the company didn't have the money or the local influence to overthrow Bengal's ruler, Siraj-ud-Dowlah. The Jagat Seths did. Tired of Siraj's reckless spending and political chaos, the Seths saw a more profitable future, one under British order. So, they made a deal with Clive. They would secretly fund the company's army in exchange for control over Bengal's treasury after victory. The result? The Battle of Plassey, a fight that lasted just a few hours, but reshaped world history. The British won, not through strength, but through finance and betrayal. The Nawab's forces, bribed with Seth money, refused to fight. Siraj-ud-Dowlah was captured and executed. And for their help, the Jagat Seths received power over Bengal's revenues. Or so they thought. Because the British had just learned something dangerous. Money wins faster than war. Within years, the East India Company would turn on its former partners, using Bengal's wealth to fund expansion and pushing the Jagat Seths into decline. The very bankers who funded the Mughal collapse had just financed their own replacement. So, how much wealth did the British actually take? And what happened to the Indian banking networks that once ruled Asia? Once Bengal fell, the British East India Company gained the Diwani, or right to collect taxes. Overnight, the company went from traders to tax collectors. But here's the twist. They didn't know how India's credit system worked. They needed local financiers, so they absorbed them. The Jagat Seths, once independent bankers, were now forced to lend under British control. In economic terms, this was the first hostile takeover in Indian history. Before 1757, Bengal's tax money circulated inside India, funding local industries, artisans, and temples. After 1757, it flowed straight to London. This was the start of what economist Dadabhai Naoroji later called the drain of wealth. Between 1757 and 1857, Britain extracted the equivalent of $45 trillion in today's money from India. And the private bankers who once ran the empire's credit system vanished, replaced by the East India Company's monopoly. The Jagat Seth family itself faced political persecution and bankruptcy. By the 1770s, their fortune, once greater than the Bank of England, was gone. The British had mastered the same system that once made India rich, but turned it outward to fund their own industrial revolution. So, could India's financial empire have survived if it had stayed independent? The numbers suggest yes, but the next century ensured otherwise. Here's something history books rarely say. Britain didn't fund its empire. India did. The taxes collected in Bengal after 1757 became the seed capital for Britain's wars in Europe, its navy expansion, and its global trade dominance. Records show that even the Napoleonic Wars were partly financed with Indian revenues. Factories in Manchester ran on Indian cotton. British exports to India skyrocketed, while Indian industries collapsed. The cycle was self-reinforcing. Indian taxes paid for British troops, which protected trade routes, which ensured more Indian taxes. The Jagat Seths legacy lived on, but not in name, in structure. Their decentralized credit network became the blueprint for colonial finance. The same system that built Bengal's prosperity now powered London's empire. It's ironic, Britain's financial revolution, banking, credit, and accounting, was perfected in India long before it arrived in Europe. So, what happened when that system finally ran dry? When the drain ended and India's wealth stopped flowing to London? That's when the empire itself began to crack. By the mid-19th century, the East India Company was gone. Britain ruled India directly, but the old financial foundations were eroding. Without India's vast trade surpluses, the British economy stagnated. The costs of empire, wars, railways, administration, outpaced the returns. The cycle that began with the Jagat Seths funding one rebellion had come full circle. Money once again dictated the fate of an empire. In 1947, as Britain left India, its debt had soared to over 200% of GDP, the same trap that ended the Mughals 2 centuries earlier. Empires fall when they forget who controls the money. For the Mughals, it was the Jagat Seths. For the British, it was the bond markets and the US dollar. So, what's the lesson? History doesn't just repeat, it compounds. The story of the Jagat Seths isn't just about one dynasty. It's a mirror for every empire that believes military power can outlast financial reality. And if history tells us anything, it can't.